Hi everyone, this is the episode number 15 of Princeton Startup TV, and this time it's coming to you all the way from Singapore, Echelon 2014. And today our guest is Danny Crichton. Is that
Crichton, yeah.
Sorry, that's the first thing I wanted to ask, but I forgot.
Yes.
Danny Crichton. So, contributing writer at TechCrunch, founding his first company in high school. Danny was formerly an investor at General Catalyst Partners, where he engaged companies in the mobile, labor, defense, and security spaces. Daniel was a Fulbright scholar in South Korea, where he was a visiting researcher at KAIST, Korean Advanced Institute of Science and Technology in Daejeon. He worked as product management at Google, where he conceived and launched Google Plus Search. His award-winning thesis was on history of Silicon Valley and Semper's Department of Computer Science. Then he graduated with honors and Phi Beta Kappa from Stanford, and with bachelor's in mathematical and computational sciences. Hey, Danny.
Hi, Beth. Nice to meet you.
Welcome to the program.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So, what are your what are your thoughts about Echelon 2014 so far?
You know, I think it's incredible to see the growth in the startup ecosystem in Singapore and Southeast Asia. I visited Singapore, I think, about 2 years ago.
Right.
And happened. I mean, there were definitely startups and investors and people who were interested in the ecosystem, but seeing it in 2012 and seeing it today in 2014, it's been incredible. I mean, not just the number of companies, but the diversity of topics, the creativity and originality that are built in here, it's really, really exceptional. So I've had a lot of fun talking to the startups in the startup alley and around here.
What are your plans for the conference overall?
So I'm a long-form writer for TechCrunch, so I write essays essentially, most recently on education and productivity. And what I'm looking here for, not so much the individual startups, but sort of inspiration for some of the changes that are happening in the region, whether it be e-commerce and the consumer markets, the way people are purchasing products, the way people are engaging through messaging or social networks, I think is starting to become really different in this region compared to the rest of the world. The trajectory that the internet is going on. And so, looking for story ideas, basically. That's what I'm here for.
So you tend to write long pieces on the trends in the startup ecosystem, and with focus on productivity and online education. Is it correct?
Yeah. So no, that was my last articles. No, I cover a huge number of different topics. Everything from labor markets and economics, which was like the last article, and a few others, to payment networks. So I wrote a long article about Square and its sort of success and non-success over the last 2 years.
IPO is postponed.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I wrote a really long article about the challenge of building enduring companies in commodity spaces like payments or cloud storage. And so I don't think of it so much as overview or explanatory journalism, but more analytical. Looking at and trying to add in a little bit of educational pieces as well as part of that, but really trying to understand what's the news behind the news. And that's what I'm hoping to see here too.
What I love about this approach is this kind of creating evergreen content, things which will be kind of relevant in 3-4 years from now.
Absolutely. Yeah. And hopefully the pieces last a long time. One of the early pieces I wrote was actually sort of the top 14 or 15 metrics that venture capitalists use when judging startups. Awesome. And interestingly enough, this content did not seem to exist anywhere on the web. Like, no one had actually written down, here are all the different ways you can sort of evaluate your startup, here's when you might use it, here's when it wouldn't be relevant. And it's interesting when you look at our own internal graphs on the traffic, it continues to do well.
Right.
And that was almost 6 months ago. And so hopefully people are able to continue to get value out of that long term.
Sounds good. What some of the pieces you wrote? And I'm sure the best are. I mean, you're saving them for the next couple of years, but just kidding. What are the top 3 articles you wrote which you're most proud of, I guess?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the key, so I'll talk about trend, the top 3 themes that I've talked about. So I think the one that is most important to me is, in 2008 there was a terrible financial crisis, and when we look at most of the rest of the country outside of Silicon Valley, that crisis still continues to this day. Unemployment, the quality of jobs, the security that comes from having a job that's there for the long term. When you look at employment figures, a lot of people are working in sort of underemployment, meaning that they're working at jobs that don't use their skills to the full amount, which means that their skills are retarding over time. They're getting worse and worse because they're not using them. And that's a huge problem for the country. It means we educated people, they go into the workforce, they don't use their skills, they lose them. That's a terrible
Such a waste,
loss and tragedy in human capital. And when I look around Silicon Valley, I don't see a lot of people caring. I don't see a lot of people focusing on issues that affect sort of family, like living and individual lives. I see a lot of, frankly, waste.
You didn't have a social, local, mobile.
The slow-mo. And that may very well be the case. I mean, if you look at a company like Uber, theoretically it's creating new jobs. Airbnb is allowing people who are homeowners to make money. So there are ways to making that economy more vibrant. And to my mind, some of the best articles I wrote, my very first one was called... Silicon Valley is now public enemy number one because we are the only place in the economy that's growing, and we're getting really rich doing this. And when people are looking at us, it's no longer as this nice, progressive, all of us benefit. It's actually, these people are taking my jobs away, replacing them with computers, and they're making a lot of money doing this. And so you sort of feel this Robin Hood effect coming up. And so a lot of my themes, and this is the theme like this last article I wrote, was around how do we get people to start thinking about the real issues? The most recent article was about how education is not the solution to a lot of these problems, that we sort of hyped MOOCs, these massive open online courses, and the hype sort of died down as people realized that just putting content online is not enough to sort of get people to really learn. So I think that's been the number one theme I really care about. The second is around, I call it the corner of TechCrunch, but sort of identifying companies that have outlived or sort of have more hype than, I don't want to say they deserve, but certainly are ahead of where they are. So my article on Square and Box and talking about the challenge of commodity companies is certainly the best performing article I've had. It was number one on TechMeme for...
This was back in March, I read it.
Yeah. This is, it was everywhere, and it did really well. And the thesis of that was, here are two companies with two very charismatic founders that do really well with journalism. Jack Dorsey and Aaron Levy at Box. And, all of a sudden, both IPOs sort of collapsed at the same time. And if you looked at the numbers from behind the scenes, in the Box's case, which are public for the S1, and in Square's case, they're private, but a lot of them have leaked out, their business models aren't that strong. And there was sort of a reality moment of, you had all these people talking about the future, and Box is going to take over, and Square's going to take over the cash register, and then when you look at it, it's like, well, actually, there's so much more work to be done. And where you're seeing this, like the company I see it today is with Fab, which has now reduced itself to, I think, like 10 employees according to Valueway. Sources, and that's, if you look 3-4 years ago, this was going to be the commerce company that's going to destroy Amazon, take over clothing and furniture.
They, I think, even fired the co-founder.
That's right, and so it's been a huge. So a huge part, I think, we are lacking in the tech press is a little bit more of that critical lens. I don't think you can just be critical. It's always going to be easier to look at two people in a garage and say, you can't do it, fuck, you're screwed. But I think you also have to have signal, and that's what I really miss, I think, in the tech media is we're a little too positive on everything rather than saying, look, here's what's actually great, here's what's good, this isn't working so well, and how do we make sure that we're actually creating signal rather than just adding to the noise that's already there.
Awesome. Let's talk about your experience at General Catalyst.
Yeah.
What were the lessons learned there?
I think there's personal lessons, and then there's sort of lessons more widely, like, in terms of ecosystem lessons. I think personally, the thing you learn as an investor really early on is how many people work in spaces that are never going to make money. And it's a really horrible feeling because you figure this out so quickly. There are spaces, and you see it because I always compare it to applying for fellowships, like a scholarship from a university. You got 1,000 applicants, and you think you're a unique snowflake, and you have never thought about this. Then you go and you read all these applications on the other side, and you're like, God, there's 100 people who said the exact same thing. And none of them are interesting because they're all saying the same thing. And I see this with startups. When you talk to, say, 1,000 startups in a year, you see certain groups of startups that clump together that are like, here's 40 startups that are doing the exact same thing. And I don't know if it's because they don't get out and they see these others, or it's because everyone sees the same opportunity. It doesn't mean the space doesn't exist, but if there are 50 competitors, you need something so totally unique, so completely, 100x, 1,000x better.
Blue ocean strategy.
That's right. I just think it's really hard. So, to my mind, the companies I always really liked, one, were deep tech. Companies that the average person just can't do. If you learned Ruby in 12 weeks, you're not just going to walk in and make a new networking, like Arista Networks went to IPO this week. Yep. You can't just produce this in a week. This is really intense, hard work. And that means there's not that much competition. And if you can actually get through the technical challenge, your company is almost guaranteed to do well. You've gotten the market, et cetera. I mean, guaranteed is always a relative term, but
absolutely.
So that to me sort of took me away from the consumer space, which I had always been really interested in. I worked at Google Plus for a summer as an intern on the launch, but I really like that kind of space. So that was like the first message. I think the second one, we're at a more mature time in the internet's life cycle. When you were building companies in '95, you could just do e-commerce and you were going to make $1 billion because you were first, and it's commerce, right? It's the entire market. Uh-huh. And when you look at companies today, they're much smaller, right? Then they're narrow markets or niches, and that's okay in most cases because we went from 10 million people on the internet to billions. So niches can be still very valuable, but I think a lot of people need to find what are the real big problems still, because so many people I think take that maturity and think I need to get smaller and more narrow and try to be sort of a little incremental improvement over what's there, and that's just not a strategy that's going to be very successful. And unfortunately, it's hard to kind of come up with those. So I think that, and then the third was just how hard recruiting was.
For general catalysts or for startups?
Across the board.
Yeah.
I mean, aggregating a lot of talent in one company is so unbelievably hard.
Full-time job.
It's a full-time job, but it's even more the importance of working on something substantive, working on really hard technical challenges, working in places where, I always ask founders, it's not about getting 5 engineers. How are you going to get 200? And how do you convince them not to go to Facebook, Dropbox, Uber, Twitter, this huge long list of Silicon Valley startups? And if you didn't have an interesting answer to that, which most obviously did not, that was my investment criteria. It's like, could you get 100 engineers to show up? And I think that actually worked fairly well. So I think those are the 3 key learnings I got out of it.
You mentioned your experience as an APM intern at Google Plus. Can you talk more about that experience and some of the lessons learned as well?
Sure. I think, working from, I started my own consulting business back in high school, like a lot of us did. I programmed since I was in kindergarten, essentially.
Was it Logo?
It was basic, yeah. It was TI basic, so it was
basic.
all calculators and all this sort of stuff. And then Hyper Studio, if you remember, on Apple. So cool. A lot of great, tools back then. And, worked on this, and I basically created a web consulting business. And first of all, you have to really learn how different types of businesses are. So like consulting, you're constantly fighting with people to pay you. You're constantly going back and forth. Is this product good enough? You set out requirements, and then people change those requirements over time. And so that can be very frustrating. When you work at a startup, everyone has to do everything, and there's a very different feel to that. When you work at a place like Google, you are a small fish in a very, very large ocean with a lot of smart people. And it's great when you're young, and I actually encourage more people to go to Google than I think you might expect, because I think you learn an immense amount in a year at a company like that. But it's so frustrating that if you want to get something done, you need to convince 20, 30, 40 people potentially and work your way up the command chain, if you will, to get something launched. I think it's getting a little bit better there, but I would say I think every new graduate should work in a company like that because you see it at its best. I think the couple of learnings, one is culture really matters, and when you set up the culture well, it can last an extremely long period of time. Google's culture is still one of the best in Silicon Valley. I really do believe that. The way it focuses on problems, the kind of people it attracts, its focus on engineering, very few companies have been able to maintain that for a very long period of time, certainly not 15, 16 years. And I think that's really incredible. That's what happens when you get it right. I think, how do you fight off bureaucracy? I don't know you can. And I think the reality is that a place like Google, where you want identity across all services, you want UIs to look cohesive, you want it to look like one company, there's just no way to be, to really experiment. The good news is, and I think one of the key lessons for CEOs and, take Microsoft, who has a new CEO this year, how do you build whole new products in fields that you have not worked on before?
Right.
And how do you use that as a way to, A, attract great people to the company, but B, to really learn something about new fields you've never really thought about
Starting
before.
from first principles.
That's right.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite lines, I think, I want to say it was Chris Sacca, but I might be getting it off, but one of the great expressions is, what would you do in a market if you could just refactor it like refactoring code? Starting over from scratch, how would you buy homes today, given everything we have today? Let's just reset. Mm-hmm. And then how do you build a startup that sort of weaves its way to get it to that point?
Yep.
And to my mind, I don't see that enough in larger companies. And that was a lesson as well, that when you grow up in a company, and a lot of the people at Google, again, that culture is really unique in that many of the people, similar to Apple, have been there since the founding or from very early times. I mean, if you look at Apple's leadership, a lot of people are 20, 25, 30-year veterans of a company. This is Silicon Valley, where the average is like a year to year. Think about that. What is it about that culture that gets people to stay decades? That's really unique. But when you grow up that way, you think a certain way. The model you read the universe is built a certain way. In Google's case, it's ads. Mm-hmm. And then when you build something like Google Plus, it's it's completely a different model. And so when you're debating with, say, the search team, it's not, they know how the hell got them search to work in the first place, but then you go to the search on Google Plus, which is what I worked on.
Yeah.
And there's a challenge around how do we work in a social environment where we want people to work on search for an hour? We want people to keep looking at more results because that's a good sign. It's a complete antithesis of what everyone had done for years. And so building that flexibility in the organization is hard.
Yeah.
That was a real lesson. So
I guess, forget about, Google is successful if the user leaves as soon as possible, right? The Google search.
That's
so
right.
Here is absolutely different paradigm.
That's right.
Yeah, and I heard that Google Plus was the first product was built thanks to the 100-day challenge.
Yeah.
Were you part of that?
I was just after this these times. So
okay.
It was about, I would say, 3 or 4 weeks before the launch.
Got it.
So during that summer, I think we launched, I want to say mid-July. I'm going to get July 10th or something like that. I forget the exact date. So I had been there about 3-4 weeks. So basically it ramped up just as everyone else was getting ready for the launch, and people were spending a lot of time in the office and that sort of thing. And again, here's another lesson, which is sort of like how a lot of African countries are not building landline phones and jumping straight to mobile.
Yeah, leapfrogging.
Leapfrogging.
Yep.
I think one of the challenges in a lot of companies is skipping a generation and saying, look, how can we have just started with mobile only, mobile's the future, we own Android. Mm-hmm. So how can we leverage the fact that, and leverage is a bad word in Google's context, but given how can we use our various products in a way that really allows us to jump way ahead of where Facebook was? Mm-hmm. That takes a lot of risk, and it takes a lot of sort of confidence in the market that you can pull it off right. What Google really should have been was Snapchat. If you think about what's the next generation, it's the ephemeral messengers. Google already has GChat, and it already has a leading messaging app. But
you were 2011, so I guess you were classmates with Bobby and Evan from Snapchat?
Yes, technically, yes. Yes, they were in the same class, yes. I did not know them at the time.
Very cool. Let's talk about, Google Plus has a great mobile app. Let's talk about some of your favorite mobile apps. How does your home screen look like?
It's, well, that's a good question. I have a lot of
top 10,
big company apps. It's interesting on the mobile app side. I am a slower adopter. One of the reasons I like to download apps and then play with them. So like Secret was a great example. Played with it, then it got a little controversial, then it was like total personal attacks. And I was like, okay, I don't need this.
Alexia was attacked as well.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of notable people were attacked.
Yeah.
And, I think I can literally go through my apps. One of the things I really love, so let me give you an example. Like take an app like Paper.
Yep.
This is a great example of a company initiative where you really allowed a team to just build something totally different. Built it in a company where a service sort of layer exists, where, look, you can display news 20 different ways. You can display the news feed in 20 different ways. And just go out and build something new and see what the market likes or does not like about it. So I also like this, another example of an app that I use fairly regularly now is NYT Now, the new New York Times app. They do a nice job of curating other content, building it into a new sort of experience. Have you played with it?
I haven't.
So
I love News Digest from Yahoo.
So that's another great example.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting,
Design-wise.
this is what's really interesting about, I think, the app world today, which is it's the most open platform I think we've ever had for distribution for the indie developers. And yet the apps that seem to be doing the best are really the big corporate apps. And what's interesting to me is, we're unbundling, we're going through this unbundling process. Foursquare went through an unbundling,
right.
Facebook's actively unbundling, Google's
Evernote.
sort of unbundling, Evernote is unbundling, and that's it's been a long-term strategy for them.
Yep.
And I think what'll be interesting to see over the next year or two, you asked me my exact favorite apps, which I'm avoiding that question.
I see.
but
just
a little bit. But
it's fine.
I think what'll be interesting is I see this being the new mobile web, in which apps will become single purpose. You will have a different type of launcher. And because when you said home screen, you remind me of this. I've been meaning to write this column, so we're gonna launch the column here on this podcast. But I really think that the home screen is going to be totally different. We're not going to look at it the way if you think back, we've had the same kind of home screen interface for 14 years, 15 years, like Pocket PC back in the 90s. Looks with a bunch of rows of icons, and it doesn't make sense when everything's just about a functionality. Like, why can I not just check in? And checking in might affect 6 apps or something like this. It's more about actions rather than specific apps. So, what I'd like to be seeing, which I'm not so much right now, is a little more creativity and innovation around that side of it.
So you said Paper,
NYT Now. I read, this is my journalism problem, which is I have to read a lot of content. So I use the new Reader app, the iOS Reader app, which just got launched.
Do you use Hacker News app?
I don't use the app. I use the website.
Website, okay.
Because I use a lot of. I never got into Flipboard.
Feedly?
I used to use Feedly until Reader came out.
Okay.
I was part of the Reader needs to come back immediately crowd.
What do you use for mail?
I use the OS 10 mail app.
Okay.
And I played with Mailbox a little bit. I have non-Gmail addresses.
Okay.
And it became kind of a problem, although I have to admit, I really would like OS 10 to actually sync my Gmail because my tablet now has hundreds of messages that don't exist on any other screen, and I can't seem to get rid of it. I don't know.
Any apps which you kind of don't see at most people?
Don't see
Like kind of some sort of apps which are not that popular, but you still love using them?
I think almost all of my apps are popular apps.
Okay. That's fine.
Actually, so one of the things I do as a journalist, what's interesting, like I said, I focus more on deep tech, so it's harder for me to really, I don't download thousands of apps. I actually do actively screen out my home screen, which is interesting. So a lot of my colleagues, of course, have like 20 pages of apps with like 20 depth of folder on it. And every time I download an app, I will play with it, and then I throw it away, and I delete it. And the reason, this is like the privacy issue that's going on today. So for instance, like Secret uploads your entire contact address book.
Yeah.
And
Pat did that as well.
Pat did this,
famously.
and it actually spams. And this, it's not just because I'm worried about spamming. It's like, as a journalist, a lot of this information has to stay confidential, context or whatnot. And so, anyway,
cool.
I'm always dealing with the privacy side.
We talked about favorite apps. What about, I guess you read books on Kindle?
Yes, I do read a lot of books on Kindle.
What are your favorite books in the, let's say, the last couple of years?
Sure, the last couple of years.
People used to kind of take picture of their bookshelves. Now people take screenshots of their Kindle books.
And actually, there was a great article in the books, New York Times books section a few years ago that talked about, romantic relationships building up through bookshelves. Like, people don't just go out for coffee. It's like, why don't you come home and like look at my bookshelf, and then you can sort of gawk and see what we read and see if there's common interests. So, what have I read? I think there's a couple of books that I think are really important. One of the things I think Edward Glazer's Triumph of the City, which talks about, I think is a great line in the introduction of that book, which was, at a time when the cost for communication is lower between anyone in the world, like we can chat, video chat, do holograms almost in some cases with some more modern products. The cost of real estate is actually moving up in cities because people want to actually live closer and closer together. And he argues that's why there's a triumph of the city. But I think that's a really interesting observation, which is just how important it is to be near smart, intelligent, creative people. It comes out of
the piece by Balaji Srinivasan from Andreessen Horowitz, "Software is Reimagining World," is exactly about that.
And people want to be near other people, and the ideas move so much quicker. And I see it just on the conference network and circuit, if you will, going from city to city. But like, you can't go to the middle of nowhere and get that same experience. Any startup that chooses to go out of a large market, doesn't have to be a large startup market, but a large market has an enormous challenge.
Right.
I think that was a really important book. One book that I think, I'm really interested in complexity theory these days.
Really?
Okay. So I'm actually, the book I was reading on the plane here is, I forget the subheading, but it's called Complexity, written by one of the faculty and residents at the Santa Fe Institute, which is the leading complexity research institute. Does a really good job of sort of giving a tour of where complexity theory is today and sort of the large questions. And one of the things I think we'll see, both because of startups and sort of engineers becoming a little more influential in society, and also because I think we have the data processing power to really understand complexity better today than we did 10 years ago. We're really going to start seeing complexity theories play a much larger role in policy making, in diplomacy, in a lot of fields that it was non-existent before, law. And that's really exciting for startups, for areas of the world where startups have not had a lot of access. But I mean, even here, there was a laws and API startup here in Singapore. And I think you're actually going to see that as a future. Like, law firms aren't just going to write laws with no semblance to anything else and sort of just a apprenticeship model. Like, people are actually going to engineer laws. And that's actually a really different world. So that's one of the other books I read recently. And then one of the more history pieces I think should be more well read, The Idea Factory, which is a history of Bell Labs. And I think this is a really important work. Bell Labs was, AT&T and actually Bell, but today would be AT&T singular and going back into the history, but produced 9 Nobel Prizes. And no other company sort of has come close to that level of production. I mean, communications theory, Claude Shannon's work on information theory and communications theory. This is a leading mathematician that worked at a company producing theoretically stuff that was obviously valuable to to Bell, but
Dennis Ritchie, Brian Kernighan.
there's a huge list. I mean, the C, it's like C, the language,
Hamming.
exactly, Hamming codes. I mean, the list of innovations and productions, I think, is unparalleled. And why is it that a lot of the large monopoly companies, maybe Microsoft, Google, a couple others, why have they not had sort of the same impact on real basic research? I don't know what the answer is, but I think looking at that history is important. So I hope that kind of work gets read more widely.
MSR, founded by Nathan Myhrvold in 1993, I guess. Doing pretty well. I guess that's one of the, I would guess, like the leading research.
Microsoft Research is absolutely, and I mean, why? Because they have 2 monopoly products. I mean, but then you get to Google. And what's interesting is Google has taken I think a very different approach, a little bit more commercialized.
Right.
Certainly, self-driving cars, I think, is a little more commercial, which is fine. But it's interesting that you haven't seen sort of that, like information theory, where it's rigorous, scholarly, academic, but sort of real fundamental that we still use in 90 different fields.
Yep.
It's gone everywhere. So concept of communications, entropy, and stuff like this. So
Cool.
anyway.
Talking about your, I guess, one of your passions, which is writing. So Ernest Hemingway is known for saying, I hate writing, but I love having written. How do you make yourself write? Let's say. Let's put it that way. Is it
Deadlines.
deadlines? Okay.
Deadlines help a little bit on writing. I think I always say, it's interesting, I always thought that quote was funny because I hate all my writing.
Right.
I always say,
in retrospect,
all my writing looks great in my head as I begin to write, and then by the end of it, I absolutely hate. I think every piece I've ever written, I think is like the worst piece. I don't know if that's. I have a high bar or like just.
That's not true about your boxes versus square case, which I enjoy.
Yeah.
I actually didn't know you back then, but I totally enjoyed the article. It kind of caught my attention as one with like top links on Hacker News. That's actually my main source of information.
Great.
And yeah, I
that's a good
loved it.
aggregator. No, and I obviously I get feedback, I get emails. Usually our TechCrunch comments aren't necessarily the nicest group of people to receive feedback from always.
What's the name of this CMU guy who is like the top comment?
Max Wolf, yeah.
Yeah, Max Wolf. Yeah, that's exactly.
He's a funny guy. I think for myself, what gets me interested in writing is, I think a lot of that feedback and realizing that a lot of this can be read for a really long time. That, the way people see box and square in some cases today is actually the model that I imprinted, if you will, on their brains.
Yep.
Because they read this article, which analyzed it with a certain model in a certain way. And I'm actually starting a PhD in the fall.
Oh, really?
So I'll be headed to Harvard's Kennedy School
Awesome.
to do public policy in a PhD program. And I think a little bit of that scholarly career is sort of the same idea, which is, you can literally define the way people perceive reality. Nothing too like grandiose. It's just if people read what you write about something, if they read your history versus someone else's history, that's the lens they see it.
Right.
That's the way they molded their mind to think of it, and that's, I think, both powerful and requires a lot of responsibility. And so that's, I think, the influence of writing.
That's a motivating factor. Let's talk about the techniques.
Yeah.
Do you have let's say myself, I have a backlog on Evernote, which is called essay ideas.
Yeah.
Where whenever I have an idea for an essay, I just put it down. When I have a free time, I just take an idea from the top of a stack and write about it. How do you approach your writing?
Same approach, actually. So I do use Evernote, and I have a long list of ideas, and they're not always pure. Sometimes I'm just like, I have one for accreditation, to talk about accreditation, analyze it a little more, come up with some ideas about what could be done. I think, because I'm in journalism, it's not just pure evergreen. I mean, we do get 90% of the views for most of the articles happen the first 72 hours, like any news site. And so, linking it to something that had just happened, linking it to what we call pegging, but pegging it to a news story is really important. So sometimes that's opportunistic. So when Vic and Dotra left Google Plus, obviously there was a really opportunistic story that I wrote like 2 hours later. I run home, I was out, and I'd go home and I write for the next like 5 hours about sort of my what I had already done in my head, but I had never written down, and so that sort of pressured me to just get it out. But I think in terms of techniques, I outline very heavily.
Okay.
So I use Omni Outliner on OS 10, and I try to really write the full argument. So in a typical outline might be about 500 words for a 2 or 2,500 word piece. So about 20% of the words have been written.
Yep.
So think of it as like 2-3 sentences of each paragraph. And then after that you're finding evidence, and I find that that's the best way to write. So I like writing in one sitting. This is why I've never written a book. I like writing the full draft at once because I like it being cohesive. I like it being one thought. If I come back to it my thoughts change so often that if I come back to it a day later, I'll come out with a totally new perspective, and then it starts to get disjointed, and you can sort of tell. So for me, that's the best. Like, do it quickly. Do it.
What's the most productive time interval for you? I mean, as a writer.
I usually write 7 to midnight.
7 to midnight.
So I'll outline maybe earlier in the day.
Right after dinner?
Usually an hour after dinner.
An hour.
So I usually have to recover. I usually eat a light dinner when I write the actual essays. I can't have a sugar rush. It can be a little. Sometimes, like the square box piece was actually a really long. That took about 10 hours straight writing.
Yeah.
So I started around 2 and ended up at around midnight. So 2 p.m. to midnight, and I didn't take a break. So that was a pretty long period of time.
Training marathon.
I usually try to write quickly and then edit.
Yep.
So I rather get words on the page first, just ideas and like the right pieces, even from the outline. Like
right,
just
edit
get it all in there, and then I'm a pretty harsh editor, so I'm pretty aggressive in trying to cut back, and then I usually edit a single piece 4 or 5 times. I'll go through it multiple times.
Is your writing sporadic? Do you like write one piece a week, one piece a month?
I write twice a week.
Twice a week.
So that is what TechCrunch wants me to do. So
does it happen on Sunday, Saturday, statistically speaking?
It's a little bit, I'm a little bit of a procrastinator, and so there's actually like the sort of end of week deadline, and then I'm like, I have to write. Sometimes it's early. Again, it depends on the news. So if there's something that comes up, I'll just do it at that time. But I usually have one piece that runs over the weekend because people don't read 3,000 word pieces on Tuesdays. So, and then sometimes I'll do a Monday piece. So sometimes I write over the weekend, and then it'll publish on Monday.
When you share your article on Twitter, do you schedule it for a certain period, or how does that work? To kind of attract
usually
people
my
in different time
article.
zones?
Yeah, it's living in Seoul. It's a little challenging because our readership is in the U.S. and so I wake up to a lot of tweets when my articles launch, particularly when they go viral. I usually don't schedule it because I don't know when it's going to go out, and then I wake up, and usually it gets scheduled when I wake up. So we usually schedule like 2 p.m. Because again, no one reads a 3,000 word article in the morning of their day. They usually do it in the afternoon when they're bored at work or whatever.
Right.
So, or just need a break, and so I try to. I usually wake up around that time, so I'll tweet it out and have conversations. I do try to engage as much as possible with people on Twitter. So when people ask me questions, I'm usually responsive.
Right.
And not as responsive on our TechCrunch comments. But I try to be nice. I'm nice on email and stuff like that. So,
do you set any New Year resolutions, or what are your thoughts on that?
New Year's resolutions.
Yeah.
I think no, I don't. I think the best approach to life is sort of long-term planning and sort of short, medium, long-term. So I have like a learning plan, meaning here are gaps in my knowledge, here are things that I want to learn more about. I don't tend to consume, outside of just journalistic news, I don't consume content when it's published. So I rarely read books the same year they're published. I rarely watch TV the same year it's like broadcast. So I'm always like years behind popular culture.
You let the crowd filter.
Yeah, I let everyone filter. Like, tell me if it's still important in 5 years, and it's amazing how important this works. Like, I think one of the things, and this is really fundamental. I'll never write this on TechCrunch, but maybe on my personal blog I will at some point. Which is, I wish people didn't get so into sort of faddish thinking and ideas. I think things come in so quickly and they leave so quickly, and it's like, let's take the paleo diet.
Right.
Is the paleo diet still going to be here in 5 years? I don't know.
Slow carb
if it is, maybe it'll be long term. But like, some stuff. Like I was joking with a friend, but like enterprise, this notion that enterprise is going to be the future of all, like consumerization of enterprise. So
it's like a huge thing. Sexy
like,
again.
It's enterprise is sexy again.
Yeah. 2012 TechCrunch
again. Again. Like that is who is ever sexy. But and then. But now it's done, and now everyone, like, because of the IPO market, no one wants to do anything in enterprise. Like enterprise VC, like, just dived. Like it's changing so rapidly. Like the ideas don't even last like 6 months before we're already throwing them out. And so for me, I don't think the world changes that fast.
Okay.
I actually think the world changes much slower. When we talk about a lot of the startups here in Southeast Asia, we're talking about e-commerce coming into mobile and stuff like this. We're talking 10 years to really see the full penetration. We're talking 2 to 5 to see it to be an interesting place to be. And that's probably the right time for a lot of startups to start. But it's not just going to happen in a year. It's never happened anywhere in a year. And so I don't feel the pressure to read books or watch TV or go to movies. Wait for it to be interesting. Is it still lasts, like if that longevity is there, you know, as a writer, that's what I want in my own work, which is 5 years from now, that's still an interesting piece and it might get referenced or someone cites it and it's like, you can think of Mark and Andreessen's Software is Eating the World. You know, these sorts of things that are continually true, have really long-term importance.
2011 piece on the Wall Street Journal, still around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So,
do you subscribe under the following hypothesis: a system of good habits beats goal setting?
oh, absolutely. I think incremental actually works for most people than transformational, which is ironic coming from the startup background where transformational is usually better because people's habits don't change overnight. I mean, if you want to get into science, it's just, neurons, the way you're wired, it doesn't just change overnight. You can't just will yourself to, you can talk about addiction to, say, nicotine or to TV or to McDonald's foods, but you're also addicted to the habits you do, like the way you tie your shoelaces. Is it comfortable because you don't think about it because you've done it so many times? You're wired to think of tying your shoes. If you try tying your shoes a different way, you use a lot of brain power. And you have to, and it's not necessarily anything better. It just uses a lot more of your brain. So
your glucose is limited.
That's right. And there's a lot of sort of psychologists that believe in sort of a supply of decision making, meaning you have a certain amount of decision making power each day that you use up, and then by the end of the day, there's a lot of studies that show that people use more. Every substance by the end of the day.
Willpower
it's
depletion.
Not because they're tired, it's actually because willpower depletion. So I really believe that. So getting into the right habits, I think, is really important. One habit that I really believe in is, again, I read more books than most, I think, a lot of people in my industry, certainly in terms of writers and investors as well. I don't believe in reading a million tweets. I try to keep my tweet load to a very focused group of people because, again, you can throw out stuff in 140 characters, but the depth work we're missing. And I think there's a book called The Shallows a couple of years ago, which is talking about how the internet is making us stupider. I don't think that's true. I disagree with that, but I do think people are starting to get a little too impatient, and people expect results too quickly. And maybe when my
Skinner box.
That's right. It's like the rat wheel and like faster. And it's interesting. I think one of the meta learnings from everything I've done is some stuff takes a really, really long time. When you look at Airbnb, it really started around 2008. That's when they first got the people at the Democratic Convention. That's where they were able to get rooms. Like, that's 6 years ago. It's a long road. That's more than half a decade. Like, that's a really, you can have you have to be 25, you're 24. It's like literally 25% of your life, 20% at the end of your life was spent doing that project. I really worry about the hackathon culture. I worry about people's ability to spend more than a little time doing a project. Most things aren't solved in a day. And there really needs to be a counterforce that says lean startup is great, it's about a habitual, but it really is about long term. And you're not necessarily going to see results the first 2 years.
Coming back to the habits, what are some of the habits which might be unique to you, and what other habits you want to develop?
Habits that are unique to me,
or maybe some interesting.
Well, I haven't done the population survey to get the right thing.
Sure.
I think so. A couple personal habits that I have. I'll just list them. So I always have inbox zero as much as possible. I never allow myself to get behind on emails.
Do you process in batches, like twice a day, or how do you?
I usually do batches. Unless I'm writing, in which case I generally am on email. I always have everything on silent. I don't have any notifications.
Same here.
So I really hate interruptions. So I actually think this is really important. I don't know how many people do this, but like, I know past Dave Moore once said, if you're on defense, not offense, if you're only taking calls but not giving calls, like I don't have that attitude about it, but one of the benefits of having asynchronous communication is I can respond when it's productively convenient for me.
Time arbitrage. Yeah.
And again, if it's interruptive, and I don't like my thoughts, if I'm in a long thinking mode, I don't like to be interrupted. I walk a lot outside in general. I think out while walking, which I think I found out actually is research has shown that you're more creative while walking and moving around. So my apartment has a rooftop deck.
Awesome.
So I walk outside when it's nice weather to get a lot of ideas. And then, I really, really aggressively curate what I read. I allow other people to decide. I trust experts.
Yep.
I trust people who are widely read. I subscribe to a site called The Browser, which is, I think, out of the UK, which is I think it's a handful of people now, but it used to be one person who just reads the web and picks his top 5 or 6 articles each day.
Awesome.
It has a nice mix, and one of the things I'd really like to see more of is actually that kind of curation, which is, and I pay like $10 a year or something, some minor amount, which I'm happy to do because I don't want to read a million articles. I want to read the best stuff. I want to read stuff that's valuable. I think it was the 4-Hour Workweek book that mentioned information diets. Don't subscribe to everything in that book, but one of the things I do believe is this idea of information dieting, which is you can be overwhelmed with details, you can be overwhelmed with things, but ultimately fundamental ideas are what really matter, and so that's what I try to focus on as much as possible in my life. So that's the core of, I think, my habits to develop.
Like talking about the summaries, I really love this website called Farnham Street, where the guy basically summarizes the books he has read. He's like a very prolific reader. And it's a great filter for me.
That's right. Yeah. I read book reviews.
Yeah.
And in a lot of cases, the book reviews are enough to read. You can read the book review realizing that you've read the book.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of books written that are one-page books spread over 300 pages. I wish that people got equal credit for the same. I wish people could write a page and get the equal credit as a book.
Right.
And it's not true in many ways, not in terms of impact, but that's the way the world works. But in terms of things to develop, I'm terrible at networking, which is ironic as a journalist. Being a journalist is a good thing because people generally come to you.
Yeah.
But cultivating the right relationships long term. Coming from I'm a split ENTJ INTJ, and I have both sides of E and I very strongly at different times. Okay. And I can really ignore people for days at a time, and then I really want to talk to people a lot. And the world hasn't adapted to that level of sort of combination extroversion, introversion, or just introverts.
I tend to be, and I say I'm introverted at work, I'm extroverted outside of work. That's a good excuse to make to stay away from interruptions.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, and so INTJs are supposedly the master strategists. That's like the stereotype of an INTJ. And that's sort of how I write too, which is looking at a full company, looking at its details, understanding its place in the ecosystem. But it's hard to argue in real life against sort of conventional wisdom that 12 people in a room sort of have. So cultivating how do you influence, how do you ensure people understand, how to persuade people on when they have a different mental model, and how do you get out of, and I see this as a policy-focused person, which is sometimes you're not debating facts, you're just debating the ways to see the world. I mean, a far more fundamental issue, are people fundamentally evil or good? And you build laws to prevent people from doing stuff, or you build laws to encourage people. I mean, you have a totally different model to see this. And, being in Singapore versus Korea, you see a very different model on how you approach different public policies. And, in a lot of cases in startups and investing, this is the same thing you see, which is how do you get people to see a different way to see the same problem? And I haven't figured that out yet. So one of the habits I want to continually inculcate or build in others and myself is how do you get out of your own model of the world? How do you see beyond, if you grew up in, say, cost-benefit analysis, and you see everything as cost-benefit, let's say you're an MBA, right? How do you move from being an MBA to a complex theorist? Which is like, we're in a system, there are feedback loops, we need to develop the right feedback system so that the right things change over time. You see this in government where public policymakers are always around cost-benefit analysis. Like always cost-benefit. But how do you develop the right feedback so you know where we should be investing resources? So you can see, we invested this in this, sort of city in this neighborhood, and that was highly valuable, but this was not. So how do we divert more money towards highly valuable and get more bang for our buck, so to speak?
Right.
Sort of an ultimate way to get cost benefit. Just different models, and I don't know.
Interesting.
That's a really fundamental thing I like to see.
Do you find software is eating venture capital interesting? Do you believe that you can hack venture capital, and analyze?
So I worked on this. So I built
as a venture hacker.
I was sort of a venture. You could call me a venture hacker. I did work on a sort of ML project around venture data,
right?
And I think it has to be combined with humans. So I think one of the things that people in the AI space sort of hype too much is that you're just going to have these machines that decide everything. And when you look at the real data, computers oftentimes beat humans, but humans backed by computers crush both really strongly.
Yeah.
And
you can see that
I really
chess
see this
tournaments.
exactly.
Yeah.
Chess is where this sort of research comes out of, but I really see it in healthcare. Your doctor doesn't necessarily remember all the pharmacological relationships between different drugs that he's prescribing. You memorize this in medical school. There's some common combinations that are dangerous or whatnot. But why do they memorize it? Why not have a computer just tell you?
Right.
Okay, but you have to decide, okay, but this patient doesn't seem to respond as well to this, so what other things do I have to choose from? You have that backing of the AI and the machine learning and that data, but you're making the real individual decision. And I think you'll see that in more spaces, and that to me that's key.
Right. We have 2 more questions to go.
Okay.
What are the most common mistakes novices make when they start writing and blogging? In your mind.
So I think there's a couple. I think the first mistake is people don't set up the right reasons why. Maybe I shouldn't say right reasons, or don't set up the reasons why they want to do something. So, why do you want to blog? I think a lot of people, I want to do it for marketing, I don't want to do it for a lot of reasons. And that's okay, but I think a lot of people when they start, it's a very disappointing experience because there's no audience.
Right.
I mean, I've always had a hard time blogging because no one reads it, okay? And fundamentally, you want to write stuff that's read. So I think getting the right mindset of how do you write about something you're passionate about? And I think the blogs that work the best, really you just start with, I just want to write about it because it's interesting, and the writing process itself helps me understand this topic better. It allows me to think it through more. It collects my thoughts in a way that I didn't really have as well ordered before. And that tends to work a lot better. So I think that's one of the first mistakes. The second is finding the right platform and audience for blogs, I think, is something that people don't think enough about.
Do you cross-post on Medium?
I have cross-posted occasionally.
Okay.
So I have experimented with Medium and cross-posting. I was there, obviously, like a lot of people in Silicon Valley, was there very early.
Yeah.
So I think the audience was a little small. I think Medium will have challenges longer term. But that maybe is a different topic for conversation. But I think people don't think enough about their audience. And when you really want to blog well, defining your audience is, I think, the most important part. And so it's not just, what are your motivations for doing it, which should be more about the problem, but also who are you writing for? I think that's the most important thing when any writing, right? Like writing an academic paper for a scholarly audience, writing a proposal to a government funding body, writing an essay for literary reasons, writing a social criticism, writing a news article. These all have different audiences. They have different tones, they have different styles. The evidentiary standards are very different. And people don't think enough about, because it's like, I'm writing for the world.
Right.
you got to narrow that down to, I'm writing for startup founders who are busy and I want to be practical. I'm writing for investors who know a lot. What are the different, that allows you to really narrow what you're going to
Sales
write.
versus marketing.
That's right.
Yeah.
And if you do that right, I think you'll have much more success.
I usually like to end with a quote, so that's kind of cheap way to be original, at least to seem original. What are your favorite quotes or a quote?
I think there's a couple of quotes. One is, fortune favors the bold, which is sort of a translation of the original from Roman times. And I think people doing bigger ideas, this is also from a Larry Page famous line as well, which is sometimes bigger ideas are actually easier to accomplish than smaller ideas, because bigger ideas attract better people, smarter people, more people, and it may actually be the case that that's actually easier in the end if you look at it more holistically than, say, a niche idea or a niche app. And that's one of the first pieces of advice I always give to founders, which is never be afraid to think bigger.
Right.
That oftentimes, investors are more interested in big ideas. They have more opportunity. Everything looks better. And so I think that it's interesting how our history has shown that over thousands of years that, sometimes it's the people who are being aggressive, who are thinking bigger, who are being bold, oftentimes do really, really well.
Yep.
It's sort of an entrepreneur's credo. The other one, which is a little more law and politics, was actually the slogan of the Carnegie Endowment a few years ago. I don't think they still use it today, but it was a line called, before it's news, it's policy. And what I always liked about that quote was, nothing happens in a vacuum. No decisions are made. So Fab laid off a ton of people this week. Right. And if you weren't following it, you might think, this week was terrible for them. But we didn't just get to this day without 2 years of decision making that led to it. And what that quote really asks about is, you have this process going back years for a lot of decisions, like Uber, where it is today. It didn't just show up and get $18.2 billion. I think I think that was a really key message. Again, it also doesn't apply just to startups, but it applies to policy where, when you look at this POW transfer last week, which was, it's a policy. I mean, these were negotiations that happened 2 years. Yes, it's news now, but well before it was news, people were deciding and debating it. And so, if as a journalist, don't just focus on the day-to-day and what's the story today. Try to figure out what's the news going to be longer term. That's what I try to do as a journalist. What's the news 6 months from now? And trying to write some of the pieces ahead of time. So you're earlier than where a lot of other
live
people
in the
are.
future,
So
build what
that's
is missing.
Right. Exactly.
Do you have anything to say, your final word to Princeton Startup TV audience? From Singapore.
From Singapore?
Yes.
I think that the number of opportunities in startups is still great. I think there's a lot of stuff to be done. But make sure not to focus on issues that only affect San Francisco and people who are between the ages of 20 and 32. Okay. If you don't understand why laundry services are having a tough time building huge companies and why that might be considered sort of short-minded, walk around outside of the universe of San Francisco. Walk through places that are harder hit. Get a wider perspective. And if that means taking a gap year to really understand how the rest of the world works, it might be going to Singapore, it might be walking through Southeast Asia, it might be walking through Detroit, which is where my parents live. Getting that wider perspective shows you a lot of different markets that people underexploit. And there's a lot of money to be made working on markets that others aren't doing.
Yep. Thanks, Danny. That
Absolutely.
was a great
Thank
episode.
you so much.
This was Princeton Startup TV episode 15. Be so good, we cannot ignore you.